Myles Garrett is on pace to break the single-season sack record. He's averaging 1.5 sacks per game. He has more sacks before age 30 than any NFL player in history. He's arguably having the greatest defensive season in league history, all while being the most dominant defensive force in football right now. And he has zero chance of winning MVP. This isn't just about one season being overlooked. This is about a fundamental problem the NFL has never solved. The league does not value defensive greatness the way it should. Myles Garrett is just the latest victim of a bias that has been baked into the sport for decades. There's only been two defensive players that have ever won league MVP before, Alan Page in 1971 and Lawrence Taylor in 1986. There was another defensive player who was robbed of that award in the mid-2010s. And to fully understand what's happening to Garrett right now, we need to go back to 2014. That year was more than just Ebola, the Ice Bucket Challenge, and a revolutionary film called Whiplash. Though that movie wasn't quite my tempo. Over in the NFL, something revolutionary was also happening. That was the year of J.J. Watt. He put together what might be the single most dominant defensive season in the past 25 years. Watt finished with 20.5 sacks. He had 29 tackles for loss. He forced 4 fumbles. But here's where it gets absurd. Watt didn't just dominate on defense. He played tight end on offense and caught 3 touchdown passes. He also recovered 2 fumbles and returned them for touchdowns. The man was literally scoring on both sides of the ball while destroying offensive lines every single week. The Texans went 9-7 that season, which wasn't great. However, Watt was doing things that had never been done before. He was a one-man wrecking crew who changed the outcome of games just by being on the field. His impact was measurable, historic, and undeniable. Then there was Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers had an excellent season for the Packers in 2014. He threw for 4,381 yards and 38 touchdowns with only 5 interceptions. His passer rating was insane at 112.2. The Packers went 12-4 and won the NFC North. By any measure, Rodgers was playing elite quarterback football. When the MVP votes came in, Rodgers won, and it wasn't particularly close either. The narrative was simple. Rodgers was the best quarterback on one of the best teams, and that's what the MVP award recognizes. Watt finished second, but the gap in voting reflected the gap in how the league values positions. Now you could argue Rodgers deserved it. His stats were incredible, and quarterback is the most important position in football. The problem is that argument ignores what the award is supposed to represent. Most valuable player. Not best quarterback, not best player on a top seed, most valuable. If you're asking which player was more valuable to his team's success, the case for Watt was overwhelming. The Texans were a mediocre team that stayed competitive largely because Watt was single-handedly dominating on both sides. Remove Watt from that roster and they're picking top 5 in the NFL draft. Remove Rodgers from the Packers and they still have a talented roster, though it wouldn't be as good. They take a step back, but they wouldn't ultimately collapse. The 2014 MVP race established a precedent that still defines the award today. Exceptional quarterback play on a winning team will always beat historic defensive dominance. Always. It doesn't matter how many records you break or how many games you single-handedly keep competitive. If you play defense and your team doesn't win enough games, you're not getting the MVP award. That precedent is exactly what's happening to Myles Garrett right now. He's putting up numbers that rival Watt's legendary 2014 season. He's the most dominant defensive player in football. He's breaking records and redefining what's possible at the position. And none of it matters because the Browns are 3-9. The NFL has decided that defensive players exist in a separate category. They can win Defensive Player of the Year, they can make All-Pro teams, they can get into the Hall of Fame. But the MVP award? That belongs to quarterbacks, and specifically to quarterbacks whose teams win a lot of games. This isn't just frustrating for defensive players, it fundamentally misunderstands what value means in football. A player who keeps a bad team from being historically terrible is providing enormous value. A player who changes how offenses game plan every single week is providing enormous value. A player who breaks records that stood for decades is providing enormous value. But the voters don't see it that way. They see wins and losses, and they credit those wins and losses primarily to the quarterback. Everything else is secondary. So let's talk about what Myles Garrett is actually doing this season because the numbers are absurd. Through 12 games in 2025, Garrett has 19 sacks. That puts him on pace for 27.5 sacks over a full 17-game season. Michael Strahan's single-season record is 22.5, set back in 2001, and tied by TJ Watt in 2022. If Garrett maintains anything close to his current pace, he's not just breaking the record, he's shattering it. However, sacks are only part of the story. Garrett has 28 tackles for loss this season, which is already more than most edge rushers accumulate in an entire year. He's forced 3 fumbles. He's been credited with pressures on nearly 28% of passing downs he's played, which leads the NFL. When you watch the tape, what stands out is how consistent he's in the backfield, disrupting plays even when he doesn't get the sack. The advanced metrics back up the eye test. And he's doing all this while facing constant double teams and chip blocks designed specifically to slow him down. Offensive coordinators are building entire game plans around neutralizing one player, and he's still dominating. Now here's where things get really interesting. There's two games in particular I want to mention. The ones where Garrett put up video game numbers and his team still lost. On October 26 against the Patriots, Garrett went off. 5 sacks. 5 sacks in a single game is historically rare. It's the kind of performance that makes you stop and appreciate what you're watching. Garrett was so dominant that game that the Patriots offensive line basically gave up trying to block him one-on-one. They started leaving tight ends and running backs to help, and he still got through. The Browns then lost 32-13. But he didn't stop there. On November 16th, a few weeks later against the Ravens, Garrett recorded 4 sacks. 4 sacks in a single game is a performance that happens once, maybe twice in a season across the entire league. It's the kind of game that usually defines a player's season and gets replayed in highlight packages for years. Garrett was unblockable that day. He was in Lamar Jackson's face on nearly every dropback, forcing hurried throws and bad decisions. And the Browns lost 23-16. Think about what that means. Garrett put up 9 sacks across 2 games, more than most edge rushers get in a season, and his team went 0-2. He was doing everything a defensive player can possibly do to help his team win, and it didn't matter. This is the cruel reality of playing defense in the modern NFL. Garrett can be perfect, and it's still not enough. He can break records and dominate games and be the best player on the field by a wide margin, and if the scoreboard doesn't cooperate, none of it counts towards the MVP conversation. Compare that to how we evaluate quarterbacks. When a quarterback throws for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns and a loss, we talk about how he kept his team in the game, or did everything he could. We separate his individual performance from the team's results. We acknowledge that football is a team sport and one player can only do so much. But when a defensive player dominates and his team loses, silence. The performance gets filed away as a footnote. The narrative becomes the team's struggles rather than the individual's excellence. There's no separation between what Garrett is doing and what the Browns are doing, even though those are 2 completely different stories. Let's be direct about what's happening here. The MVP award is fundamentally transformed into something it was never supposed to be. It's no longer about the most valuable player in the league. It's about the best quarterback on a top-seeded team. That's the formula. That's what voters look for. Everything else is window dressing. And this isn't speculation. Look at the last 20 NFL MVP winners. 17 of them are quarterbacks. The 3 exceptions were running backs on teams that won their divisions. Not a single defensive player has won the award since Lawrence Taylor in 1986. It's almost 40 years of defensive excellence being systematically excluded from the highest individual honor in football. The criteria has shifted so dramatically that we don't even pretend anymore. Now it's obvious that quarterback is the most important position, and therefore quarterbacks should win MVP most often. The problem is that's not what the award claims to recognize. It's called most valuable player, not most valuable quarterback. If we're going to be honest about what the award has become, we should just rename it and create a separate award for actual value across all positions. But let's talk about the team record problem specifically, because this is where logic completely falls apart. The Browns are 3-9. That record is terrible. It's bottom 5 in the league. It's the kind of record that gets coaches fired, hopefully, and front offices cleared out, hopefully. But apparently Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski are untouchable in the city of Cleveland, which I don't understand. And yes, that record is absolutely being held against Garrett in the MVP conversation. Football is the ultimate team sport. There are 22 starters and 53 players on a roster. One player, no matter how dominant, can only affect so much. A defensive end maybe plays 60 to 70 snaps per game. He has zero control over whether his offense scores points. He has limited control over what the rest of the defense does. He can't call plays, he can't fix special teams mistakes, he can't make the offensive line look better or the receivers catch passes. The Browns are 3-9 because they have the 31st ranked passing offense in the league. Their quarterback situation has been a disaster. Their offensive line can't protect. Their receivers can't separate. The entire offensive side of the ball has been dysfunctional all season. None of that has anything to do with Myles Garrett. He's doing his job at a historic level. The fact that the offense can't score doesn't diminish his value. It actually makes it more obvious. The Browns would be unwatchable without him. They'd be getting blown out by 30 points every week instead of losing, sometimes, competitive games. That's the definition of value. A player who keeps a terrible team from being historically terrible is providing enormous value to his organization. But here's where the position bias becomes impossible to ignore. We talk about supporting cast for quarterbacks and offensive line play and receiver talent. We acknowledge that a quarterback can really only do so much if the defense can't stop anybody. We don't extend that logic to defensive players. When a defensive player dominates and his team loses, we can just really shrug and move on. That's just fundamental unfairness that Garrett is experiencing. He's being judged by a standard that no defensive player can meet while playing for a losing team, regardless of how dominant he is individually. What's happening to Myles Garrett isn't new. It's a pattern that's been repeating for decades. The NFL has a long history of watching defensive players do things that shouldn't be possible and then finding reasons why those performances don't count for the league's top individual honor. JJ Watt in 2014 was the most obvious example, but we have plenty of other examples. Aaron Donald won 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards and never seriously competed for MVP. Von Miller was the best defensive player in football for years and never got close. Even Lawrence Taylor, the last defensive player to actually win the award, had to put up numbers so absurd that voters literally had no choice but to recognize him. The standard for defensive players isn't just higher than quarterbacks, it's impossibly higher. A quarterback can win MVP by being very good on a very good team. See Josh Allen last year, Lamar Jackson the year before that. A defensive player has to be historically dominant on at least a decent team, and even then, it's not a guarantee. What makes this particularly frustrating is that we all know defensive dominance when we see it. When Garrett lines up, offensive coordinators completely change their game plans. They keep tight ends in to help. They slide protection in his direction. They call quick passes to get the ball out before he can get home. Entire offensive strategies are built around the simple goal of not letting Myles Garrett wreck the game, and he still does. That's impact, and that's value. The tragedy is that Garrett's prime years are being wasted on a team that can't capitalize on his dominance. He's 29 years old right now. He's in the absolute peak of his powers. He's doing things that edge rushers dream about doing. And instead of competing for championships, he's watching his team lose games despite his best efforts. Now, part of that is his fault. He did request a trade, and then he kind of doubled back when they were going to give him $40 million per year, which I completely understand. But at the same time, this team stinks. This is what happens when the NFL systematically undervalues defensive excellence. Garrett will finish this season with potentially record-breaking numbers. He'll win Defensive Player of the Year, probably unanimously. He'll make an All-Pro. He'll get praised by coaches and teammates and analysts who understand what they're watching. And then the MVP will go to a quarterback whose team won 12 or 13 games. The voters will justify it by pointing out to wins and losses and team success. They'll acknowledge that Garrett had a great season, but ultimately the award goes to a player who meant the most to his team's success, and success means winning games. This is how the NFL has decided to evaluate value. And unless something fundamentally changes in how voters think about the award, this is how it will continue to work. Myles Garrett is the best player in football right now. Not the best defensive player, the best player, period. He's breaking records that have stood for the test of time. He's dominating games at a level we rarely ever see. And none of it matters for MVP because he plays defense for a bad team. That's not a reflection on Garrett. It's a reflection on how the NFL chooses to define value. The league has decided that defensive greatness, no matter how historic, will always be secondary to quarterback play on winning teams. Garrett's legacy will be defined by his dominance on the field, not the awards he didn't win. Future generations will watch his tape and wonder how voters could have watched that level of performance and decided it wasn't valuable enough. They'll be right to wonder. And that's really all I have for you today. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you're new, and see you soon.